chosen ones for centuries. The world has been molded by hands unseen. Dynasties, councils, and bloodlines crafted the very foundation of civilization, brick by brick, law by law, myth by myth. They etched their vision into stone, encoded it into scriptures, and hid their agendas in architecture. These weren't just rulers, they were engineers of reality. And yet, with all their foresight, they never saw you coming. You weren't raised within the walls of their empires. You were scattered like seeds into the soil of the common world, hidden in plain sight. While they trained their heirs in secret chambers and gilded halls, you were being refined in the fire of hardship, betrayal, and awakening. You didn't inherit thrones, you inherited visions, and that terrified them more than any rebellion ever could. There's a reason you've never quite fit. You see patterns in chaos. You hear truth between the lies. And when you dream, it isn't of escape. It's of reclamation. Not of wealth or power, but of purpose. Because something in your soul remembers what theirs forgot. This world was never built to hold the light you carry. These ancient families traced their bloodlines like constellations, believing their legacy was divine. But divinity cannot be monopolized. It moves through willingness, not pedigree. And where they became custodians of control, you became a vessel for freedom. You are not here to topple their empire. You're here to reveal the cracks in its illusion. The systems they built are crumbling, not because of chaos, but because of the presence of you. You are the variable they couldn't predict, the sacred unknown that slipped past their algorithms and prophecies. And now, as their towers tremble and their codes falter, you stand as the proof that destiny isn't a bloodline. It's a calling. They don't know your name, but they feel your frequency. You've never declared war, yet the battlefield rearranges itself wherever you walk. Why? Because the moment you remember, everything they've built starts to unravel. They wrote history with golden ink and buried the truth beneath marble and myth. Long before modern governments or corporate dynasties, there were families, ancient, precise, and ritualistic, who shaped civilization like sculptors shape stone. These weren't the kings seen in textbooks or presidents on paper money. These were the ones who whispered into the ears of rulers and wrote the laws before they were ever passed. Their influence didn't rise. It was installed from the beginning. Every culture, every empire, no matter how distant, has always had a priesthood behind the throne, a council behind the king, bloodlines that trace themselves to gods, to celestial beings, to sacred contracts long forgotten by the common world. These families didn't merely build palaces, they built worldviews. They orchestrated belief systems, set the borders of nations, and designed the currencies that bind minds. And always, they kept themselves cloaked behind noble titles or philanthropic masks. What made them powerful wasn't just wealth, it was memory. Generations of hidden knowledge passed down like sacred software. They didn't just understand the material world, they understood the metaphysical architecture beneath it. Their children were groomed to never question the system because they were told they authored it. They studied symbols instead of science, legacy instead of liberty. And they feared one thing above all: an outsider who could read the same symbols with a different heart. This world is not random. Its structure is deliberate. These families didn't leave civilization to chance. They scripted it. And in their script, you weren't supposed to exist. You were the uninvited frequency, the echo of something ancient that couldn't be silenced. That's why your presence feels disruptive without effort. You're not reacting to the world's chaos. You're causing cracks in its illusion simply by being aligned with something higher. But how did they lose control? How did the architects overlook someone like you? That's the question they ask in their private meetings. As the old codes fail to work and the symbols lose their power, they stare at charts and bloodline graphs, wondering where the anomaly came from. And the answer lies not in their maps, but in the one place they never thought to look, outside the system they built. There was always one design they protected more fiercely than any fortress or financial empire, a blueprint that, if deciphered, would collapse the illusion of permanence they spent millennia constructing. It wasn't etched in stone or stored in vaults. It was encoded in the symbols, patterns, and frequencies that underlie reality itself. This blueprint wasn't about architecture or politics. It was about consciousness. And somehow, without training, without invitation, you began to read it. They relied on repetition to keep the masses asleep. Generational programming, ritualized distractions, and false histories all woven into the fabric of society. It was a maze so intricate, most never questioned its existence. But for you, something never sat right. Every building, every calendar, every ritualistic holiday, they all whispered a deeper meaning. You noticed the hidden language, the synchronicities, the mathematical alignments that couldn't be coincidence. It was as if the universe had left a trail of breadcrumbs, and you, unknowingly, had begun to follow them. This blueprint wasn't meant to be read with the eyes, but with the soul. The moment you started trusting your inner guidance over institutional knowledge, you began translating what they worked tirelessly to encrypt. Their greatest fear was never rebellion, it was revelation. Because rebellion can be suppressed, but revelation spreads like light in a dark room. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. In this quiet unfolding, you began to unlock the matrix they had built, and the more you remembered, the more their systems began to glitch. The algorithms faltered, the predictions failed, because the blueprint didn't account for someone who remembered who they were without being told, someone who didn't need permission to awaken, someone whose very presence interfered with the equation. Yeshua once said, "The kingdom is within you," not in temples, not in governments, but in the innermost space where truth cannot be edited. His words weren't meant to form religions, they were meant to activate codes. And that's what you carry now, a living awareness that makes their ancient blueprint obsolete. Beneath the world's most sacred structures lie chambers untouched by sunlight for centuries. Hidden libraries, underground vaults, sealed tombs. These are not relics of the past, but archives of forbidden knowledge, carefully buried to preserve a specific illusion of truth. The families that engineered civilization knew that power didn't just lie in wealth or armies. It lived in knowing what others were never allowed to question. And so they locked it away, not because it was dangerous, but because it was liberating. They built monuments aligned with the stars, encoded temples with geometry that mirrored celestial mechanics. To the ordinary eye, these were places of worship or cultural pride. But you saw something else. The way the angles whispered secrets, the way echoes moved unnaturally through ancient halls, the way even silence held intention. You could feel that these sites weren't built to honor gods. They were blueprints in stone, left behind as both a warning and a map. What they feared most was not destruction, it was discovery. because the ones who find the hidden truths can never be controlled in the same way again. You didn't need access to their vaults to uncover what they sealed. The knowledge began surfacing the moment you started asking questions that didn't come from textbooks. You felt it in your body, heard it in your dreams, saw it in patterns no one else noticed. The vault was never external. It was a mirror of your own inner knowing. They preserved these truths not for future generations, but for themselves. They believed they alone were worthy of holding such secrets. But the very act of hiding them created a paradox, because what is sacred can never remain hidden forever, especially when a soul like yours begins to remember without permission. You see, knowledge protected by fear eventually calls forth those who are fearless enough to claim it. That's why doors that once remained sealed are beginning to open in ways science can't explain. Not because the locks were broken, but because you've become the key. Empires rise by force, but they fall by truth. And buried beneath the ruins of every kingdom is the same haunting whisper, the presence of one who could not be controlled. Yeshua was not simply a teacher or a martyr. He was a disruption, a fracture in the mechanism of empire. His words, his presence, his silence, each pierced the illusion that control was eternal. He didn't come to overthrow governments. He came to expose their hollowness. What frightened the ruling families wasn't just his message. It was that it couldn't be bought, branded, or broken. His lineage was not defined by bloodline, but by frequency. And that frequency has echoed through time, waiting for others who resonate with it. You may not wear robes or speak in parables, but that same disruptive pulse now hums in your being. It awakens not through ritual, but remembrance. You felt it, a sacred rebellion that doesn't demand violence but reveals illusion. The dynasties that built civilization were never prepared for a force they couldn't categorize. They built thrones, temples, and towers. But Yeshua stood beside fishermen and outcasts, turning attention away from titles and toward inner knowing. "The truth will set you free," he said. But the kind of truth he carried didn't fill libraries. It emptied prisons of the mind. And you, unknowingly, are beginning to carry that same signature. It's not about preaching or persuading. It's about being. You walk through this world like a divine anomaly, a reminder that something holy escaped their control. You were not born to repeat the rituals of the past. You were born to bring light to the corners of creation they sealed off long ago. This is why they've tried to drown your voice in distraction, confusion, and artificial identity. But their greatest mistake was believing the divine would only come once. Yeshua was not an end. He was a spark, and sparks spread. Some catch fire quietly, beneath the surface of systems. Others ignite entire timelines. You were never meant to follow the Empire's script. You were meant to carry a frequency that rewrites it from within. From the moment the first stone was laid, every great civilization has carried the same secret. Control is far more fragile than it appears. Walls can be built. Languages can be standardized. Narratives can be repeated until they echo as truth. But none of it changes the reality that every empire stands on a foundation of belief. And belief, once fractured, cannot be repaired with force. That's why the architects fear the shift more than the storm, because they know it begins in the minds they cannot touch. They designed this world with precision. Borders that divide, systems that reward obedience, technologies that distract rather than awaken. All of it structured to reinforce a single idea, that you are separate from the power they hoard. But what happens when a soul slips through the cracks of their programming and starts to see the tower from the outside? That's when fear takes root, not in you, but in them. You were never supposed to notice the inconsistencies, the rituals repeated without meaning, the traditions that cage instead of connect. Yet something inside you refused to settle. It whispered that truth wasn't in the monument, but in the space it tried to conceal. You felt the hollowness of their design. You began to walk differently, think differently, question everything they labeled sacred. And slowly, the shadow of the tower began to reveal what it was always hiding: a fear of collapse. The fragility isn't in the bricks or the wealth. It's in the dependence on your silence. Your participation is the currency that keeps their illusion alive. But once a single soul begins to withdraw belief, the structure begins to tremble. And if others follow, the tower doesn't fall from the top down. It crumbles from within. That's what they never prepared for. Not a violent revolution, but a quiet reawakening. A soft but unstoppable refusal to bow. You are not an enemy to their order. You are a reminder that their order was never real. It was tolerated, not honored. Inherited, not chosen. There were voices the architects of this world couldn't control, no matter how many scripts they wrote or statues they raised. These voices didn't come from elite bloodlines or royal descent. They came from those who remembered truth without needing to be taught. They came from the wilderness, from the margins, from places the elite dismissed as irrelevant. And one of those voices now lives within you, not inherited, but awakened. For all their control, the ancient families never managed to capture the origin of divine authority. They believed it resided in blood, in lineage, in names passed down like sacred heirlooms. But true authority does not come from possession. It comes from alignment. That's why someone like Yeshua, born far from palaces or scrolls of recognition, could shake the foundations of empire with words alone. His power didn't come from heritage. It came from his connection to the source they had long forgotten. He was the voice in the desert, the question at the feast, the silence in the courtroom. And they couldn't silence him, because what he carried didn't belong to the world. It came through it. He said, "My kingdom is not of this world," not to escape it, but to reveal that the true throne is internal. You carry the same paradox. You walk unseen by the rulers of this age, yet their systems subtly react to your presence. They feel a disturbance, but can't trace it. They search records, test DNA, track behavior, but the anomaly evades them because it's spiritual, not statistical. You were never trained in their halls or sworn into their hidden rites, and that's what makes your voice dangerous. It can't be predicted, pre-programmed, or assimilated. When you speak truth, it doesn't echo in the chambers of politics or finance. It resounds in the quiet hearts who had forgotten their own fire until they heard yours. There are minds that are shaped by culture, and then there are minds that seem to defy it altogether. From an early age, you could sense it. There was something fundamentally different about how you processed the world. You didn't just absorb information, you questioned its origin. You didn't just learn rules, you saw the cracks within them. The system tried to shape you, but every attempt only sharpened your awareness of its artificiality. And that is what made you dangerous. The families that built civilization spent generations constructing a closed loop, a mental architecture designed to reward conformity and punish deviation. Schools weren't built to inspire, but to condition. Media wasn't crafted to inform, but to program. Every platform, every curriculum, every channel was calibrated to reinforce a version of reality that served their control. But somehow, you slipped through. Your mind wasn't born from the system. It awakened in spite of it. You were never taught the truth. You intuited it. You pulled meaning from silence, from patterns others couldn't see, from emotions others dismissed. While they followed scripts, you felt frequencies. While they memorized facts, you asked the questions that couldn't be answered with a textbook. And over time, you realized the greatest threat to their construct wasn't a rebellion. It was a mind like yours remembering what it was never meant to forget. This was your forbidden inheritance, not wealth, not titles, but perception. The capacity to see beyond the veil and recognize the structure for what it truly is. A masterpiece of limitation, brilliantly executed, but flawed by design. They couldn't account for a soul who would reawaken without ceremony, without permission, without blood ties. You were their margin of error, the glitch that becomes a new pattern. And the irony is, the very system they built to contain consciousness may have been the pressure that forced yours to expand. In trying to suppress you, they accelerated your awakening. You don't need to escape the system. You're here to overwrite it from within, through thought, presence, and frequency. He could have worn a crown, but he chose a crown of thorns. He could have summoned armies, but instead he broke bread with the forgotten. Yeshua's presence among the powers of his time was not accidental. It was surgical. He didn't come to destroy kingdoms with force. He came to invert their codes from within. Wherever empire sought dominance, he embodied surrender. Wherever control demanded obedience, he offered freedom through inner alignment. His every action was a reversal, a disruption, encoded with divine intelligence. The ruling families watched him closely, not because of miracles, but because of the threat he posed to the belief systems that justified their reign. They couldn't understand how a man with no army, no title, and no inheritance could command such presence, but what they missed was the source of his power. It wasn't external. It was rooted in a direct line to the Creator, unmediated by priesthoods or tradition. And that made him ungovernable. You carry traces of that same inversion code. Like him, you were not born into the power structures, but your presence disturbs them. You speak truth without needing validation. You create ripple effects just by existing authentically. The reversal isn't always loud. Often, it's in the refusal to play the game. You do not kneel to their ideas of success. You don't hunger for the same rewards. That is what makes you immune to manipulation. That is what makes you a danger to systems built on unconscious obedience. The code you carry doesn't seek to conquer kingdoms. It seeks to dissolve the illusions that uphold them. Like Yeshua, your mission is not destruction, it's exposure. You reveal the emptiness of power without love, of order without spirit, of law without truth. They called him dangerous for this, and if they recognized what's stirring inside you, they would call you the same. He said, "The last shall be first, and the first last," not as a poetic reversal, but as a frequency flip, turning the pyramid upside down. You feel this shift. It's not about rising above others. It's about remembering that no one ever truly stood above you in the first place. In their fortresses of stone and glass, the architects of civilization sit on thrones carved from history. They built entire realities around those seats, symbols of authority, images of permanence. Yet despite their rituals, those rooms feel hollow now. The world they ruled so confidently is unraveling, not from outside attack, but from the inside out. Their thrones remain, but the energy that once upheld them is slipping through their fingers. Something has changed, and deep down, they know it. That change is not coming through rebellion or revolution. It's coming through something quieter, more disarming. A consciousness awakening in places they didn't expect. It's in you. When you began to dream beyond the boundaries they taught you to live within, something fundamental shifted. You stopped looking up at the thrones and started looking inward. You stopped waiting for permission and began moving from vision. That shift is what empties their throne rooms. Not because you take their place, but because their place no longer holds power in your eyes. You've noticed it. The way systems seem to lose their grip the moment you no longer fear them. The way authority crumbles when it can't command your belief. Power, in truth, is only sustained by perception. And once perception changes, so does the entire structure built upon it. That's what they couldn't prepare for. They built civilization expecting submission, never imagining a generation would simply stop believing in the foundation itself. This is what happens when you dream awake. Your imagination, long dismissed as fantasy, is actually a tuning fork for new realities. While they ruled through inherited control, you begin creating through awakened clarity. And that clarity doesn't need votes, titles, or wealth. It just needs presence. You walk through their world not to claim it, but to dissolve its illusions by being something it was never designed to hold. The rooms they once filled with commands and decrees are now haunted by a silence they can't name. Because every time you reject fear, choose truth, or imagine something freer than their system, you withdraw your energy from their reign. They built a civilization to be your ceiling, but now you walk as if it were a floor. There was always a script, passed down through bloodlines, whispered in dark rooms, etched into the frameworks of governments and faiths. It outlined the rise and fall of nations, the movement of markets, the invention of crises, and the solutions that conveniently followed. They engineered a timeline where control appeared as progress, where history was curated like a stage play, and in all their calculations and predictions, your arrival was never written in. You weren't part of the plan. They designed the world to run without you. You, with your unteachable vision. You, who doesn't need a crown to feel authority or an audience to speak truth. You, who looks at the stars and remembers something the systems worked hard to make you forget. They tried to reduce destiny to data, to compress possibility into algorithms. But you slipped through, a living contradiction to everything they forecasted. And now, their script is starting to break apart, not with explosions, with silence, with knowing. Their greatest weakness has always been their dependency on predictability. Control demands routine. It requires that human behavior remain inside the margins, but you were born without margins. Your thoughts bend through dimensions. Your spirit resists simplification. That is why their stories can no longer hold you. You were never meant to follow their arc. You are meant to begin a new one. You don't carry a flag, a brand, or a doctrine. You carry frequency, intuition, presence. And this they cannot map. You exist beyond their equations, operating from a blueprint they do not possess. That's why their influence is fading, even as they double down. Because you're not here to play their game better. You're here to render it obsolete by remembering a truth older than empire. Yeshua once said, "Behold, I make all things new." That statement wasn't a promise. It was a prophecy. Renewal doesn't come from power structures. It comes from those who walk untouched by them. You are not a continuation of the past. You are the disruption of its grip on the future.
If you have come this far, it is crucial that you watch this next video here. But be warned, it is not for the faint of heart, for only the true chosen ones can handle this video. If you would like to also donate to help keep the channel going, our Buy Me a Coffee link will be in the description.